Hi again, welcome to day 2 of our Washington Can't Wait Week of Action, and thanks for tuning in for today's land use and climate change panel. My name is Jamie. I use she, hers pronouns, and I'm the lead organizer with FutureWise's Washington Can't Wait campaign. So before we dive in, I just want to give a quick Zoom orientation for folks who might not be too familiar with this platform. This should be more or less what your screen looks like. In the top right-hand corner, you'll be able to change the layout and the orientation of your screen. On the bottom bar, you'll see options to mute yourself, to turn your video on or off, and you'll also be able to access the chat, and you should see our live transcription running at the bottom of your screen as well. So if you haven't yet, feel free to open that chat up and introduce yourself, share your name, where you're calling from today. We do ask I just muted myself. We do ask that you stay on mute for the duration of this event to help us reduce background noise, and that you use the chat to ask questions when we get to the Q&A portion of this meeting. We are also recording this panel for folks who aren't able to join, so if you'd rather not be in the recording, please keep your video turned off. As always, I want to start by acknowledging that unless you're indigenous to the land that you call home, then you are occupying stolen lands. We want to express our gratitude as guests on these lands and thank the original and current stewards. We also want to acknowledge and honor the Black, Brown, and Asian individuals on whose labor this country was built. If you don't already know, this website that we're sharing in the chat is a resource to begin the learning process of whose lands you occupy. It's definitely not comprehensive, but it's a really good place to start. So as you have the time, I encourage you all to learn a little bit more about the land that you're on, as well as what you can do to uphold and honor tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. I am on the land of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish, the Stillaguamish, and Suquamish, past and present. So if you know whose land you're on, please put it in the chat and share. So today we're here to talk about land use and climate change. The decisions that we make about land use have really profound impacts on climate, from ensuring that people have access to housing that protects them from the worst impacts of climate hazards, to designing cities that lower our greenhouse gas emissions, making sure that communities of color do not bear the brunt of environmental hazards, that folks have access to green space, healthy food, that we're protecting our forests and our farmlands and our critical habitats and all the other species that we're sharing this planet with. The impact of land use policy on the climate crisis is really robust and profound, and it's a really intersectional issue. So we're here today to dive into this a little bit with a really incredible lineup of panelists. So we'll start this event by hearing from each of our 3 panelists who will speak to different aspects of this topic, bringing their own unique perspectives from their individual work. After all 3 of the panelists have presented, we'll have time for question and answer. So we'll have y'all post your questions in the chat and hopefully have a really dynamic and interesting discussion. And then we'll close out in just the last couple of minutes together by sharing a little information about a bill that the Washington Can't Wait campaign is working on to address climate change through our land use policy, and how you all can help get involved to make sure it passes in 2022. But first, let's meet our panelists. We are joined today by Katie Fields. Katie is the Forest and Communities Program Manager with Washington Environmental Council. She works from the principle that strong and trusting relationships are fundamental to achieving enduring, equitable policy solutions. Prior to joining WEC, Katie worked with the Southern Willamette Forest Collaborative, engaging with agency partners and rural stakeholders on forest restoration, recreation, and economic development projects, and with the Sustainable Cities Institute, where she helped rural communities plan for social, economic, and environmental resilience. She holds dual master's degrees in public administration and conflict dispute resolution with concentrations in environmental policy and collaborative governance. And we are super, super happy to have her with us today. We're also joined today by Australia, who is Whatcom County Promotora at Community to Community that helps organize rural, campesino, and immigrant families to be at the forefront of their own stories, issues, and solutions while connecting farm workers to resources and providing know your rights orientations. Australia grew up in Los Angeles, California, and moved to various places in the Southwest before settling in Eastern Washington. She belongs to a family of strong and resilient farm workers that have modeled her pathway to serve others, especially in diverse agricultural communities. Her bisabuelita, her great-grandmother, was the first promotora she encountered that had a heart of love and justice and service. She's passionate about farm worker rights as a means to transform our food system and society into a just transition. Thank you, Australia, for being here today. And then finally, we'll hear from Breean Beggs, who serves as the Spokane City Council President. Breean is devoted to advocacy for all people and community reconciliation. For more than 20 years, he has effectively presented cases and causes to juries, appellate judges, arbitrators, mediators, community groups, and the media. Some highlights of his work include substantial police reform measures in connection with the death of a mentally disabled janitor in Spokane, substantial national reform on oil pipeline safety, multiple jail and criminal justice reform issues in Spokane County, and he is currently leading efforts to increase housing units in Spokane and community sustainability, decrease homelessness and crime, and facilitate community conversations on equity and inclusion. Thank you so much, Breean. We're excited to hear from you today. And so we'll just dive right in. I'm going to hand the mic off to Katie, who will start by offering some broader context on the climate crisis in Washington and how it intersects with our land use decisions.
Thank you, Jamie. And I want to thank everybody at FutureWise for pulling this panel together and for all of the activities happening this week. I'd also like to thank the other panelists and everybody who is attending today's panel. I'm looking forward to a great discussion today about the urgency of including the climate crisis in land use planning. As a little bit of background, I work with the Washington Environmental Council and Washington Conservation Voters, which are two parts of the same organization. And we're working closely with FutureWise on bill development and policy around House Bill 1099. Washington Environmental Council develops and advocates alongside partners and coalitions to ensure environmental progress and justice by centering and amplifying the voices of the most impacted communities in our state. As the Forest and Communities Program Manager, I'm part of the forestry team, and I focus my work on local, voluntary, and incentive-based policies that help communities address a range of forest issues, including wildfire and ecological management of Washington's forests. The types of impacts that we've seen in Washington from climate change already are severe and many in number. We've seen sea level rise, flooding, droughts, heat waves, and wildfires. And we know that these issues will only increase with time, and the time is urgent to help adapt and mitigate through land use planning as a major component. And we also know that this must be done equitably. So I'm going to go through a few different examples of some of the effects that we've seen in Washington state, and then talk about this in the context of land use planning. So first of all, this summer, communities throughout Washington experienced record-breaking temperatures. In Chelan County, temperatures reached 119 degrees. It was 109 degrees in Spokane, and it was even 110 at one weather station on the Olympic Peninsula. According to a World Weather Attribution analysis, this heat dome would have been a 1 in 150,000 year event prior to the Industrial Revolution, and now it's a 1 in 1,000 year event, or 150 times more likely than if the 1.2 degrees of warming that we've experienced since the Industrial Revolution hadn't happened. What that means in Washington is 138 people lost their lives. And we know that there's greater risk to unhoused populations, people who work outside like farm workers and timber workers, and people with underlying health disparities. We also know that the urban heat island effect, where there are areas of greater heat than in outlying areas due to human activities and infrastructure in cities, has a greater impact on areas with lower income and higher proportion of overburdened communities. We also know that redline neighborhoods are especially lacking in natural infrastructure like tree canopy, and tree canopy is a helpful way to mitigate that heat island effect. There's also a lack of air conditioning, especially among overburdened populations, and we also are lacking in the state of Washington for infrastructure for supporting air conditioning. And another infrastructure impact from climate change and heat waves is the impact on roadways and railways. We saw during the summer significant impacts to roadways that melted and temporary shutdowns of railway facilities due to the impacts of the heat. After the summer heat wave, communities again experienced impacts from climate change in the fall, this time in the form of flooding. During November's heavy rains, 75% of homes in the town of Sumas were damaged. And we know that as more precipitation is falling as rain in the wintertime rather than as snow, we're having higher stream flows that impact our transportation systems as well as our housing. We also know that the flip side of that is drought. With less snowpack, we're having drier summers and lower stream flows, which harms fish and increases the risk of wildfire, as well as lengthening the wildfire season. More on that in a minute. We also know that drought and flooding lead to algal blooms and pollution events. And both flooding and drought have impacts on resource-based economies, including recreation, agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. And these impacts are strongest, again, for overburdened communities. With drought comes an increased number of days with wildfire and smoke in Washington. There are greater impacts for farm workers and others who have no choice but to be outside during smoke events, including unhoused people. The Latinx population in Washington is twice as likely to live in areas most threatened by wildfires, and Latinx and Black populations are more vulnerable to the impacts of fire. They're more likely to live in substandard housing, more likely to be unhoused, more likely to work outside, and less likely to have paid time off or health insurance. Building in the wildland urban interface, which is that area where development and forests such as development and natural landscapes such as forest, shrublands, or grasslands meet, is an important consideration as we make land use plans that are adaptive to climate change. We need to be very thoughtful and considerate where and how building happens in that space. We also know that there's a lack of resources for renters, including migrant populations, and that higher value homes are often given more resources for protection during wildfire and smoke events. And we also know that there's an urgent need for emergency transportation and shelter when these events happen. All of these climate impacts have connections to land use. We know some jurisdictions are more vulnerable to flooding, while others are more vulnerable to wildfire, and that the unique challenges for different geographies throughout Washington need a locally appropriate approach, which must include consideration of the local communities who are uniquely vulnerable to the effects of the climate hazards in each area. The Growth Management Act is not serving Washington's needs because it's not addressing climate change. 1099 is long overdue, and it will strengthen comprehensive planning in the state by using the instruments we have to better meet the needs of Washingtonians as climate change impacts become more frequent and severe. We need to plan for both mitigation and adaptation, and the urgency is great. We're not planning on reinventing the wheel, but we're intending to strengthen the Growth Management Act for what communities in Washington need as climate impacts increase. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie, for sharing that really important background and sort of, a really great overview of all the ways that our land use decisions are intersecting with the climate crisis and the ways that it's impacting our communities disproportionately. So I'm going to now pass it over to Australia to share a little bit about her work and the importance of planning for climate resiliency in our communities.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for having us community to community here in this space. My name is Tobon. I'm a Whatcom County Promotora, a community organizer here, place-based in Whatcom and in Skagit counties. I really look forward to this talk, this panel, because of the timeliness. We've been hit really hard with the flood in our community. We're actively having promotoras helping with the flood rapid response to our community members who are from farm worker immigrant communities. Community to community, for those who don't know who we are a women-led based grassroots organization focused on three main components: food sovereignty, farm worker rights, and also the need for participatory democracy. These intersections of food and the people and the rights that people most impacted at working the land intersect together with our work as promotoras, frontline impacted community members, we're farm workers, we're women of color in our communities who live in our communities and also have been affected by a lot of these disasters and also changes in climate. So the connection between, this proposed legislation is very timely, with the term of like just planning in communities that don't really have a voice in land use in their areas. And we found through a lot of our work, we've been climate justice warriors for quite some time. Notable things that have happened in our community with the death of a farm worker in 2018 at Sarbanon Farms due to excessive heat really illustrate the need to continue to be in spaces to make policy changes to land use and related to climate change, from heat record waves here in our communities, providing air quality education, but also understanding from community members what needs to be done to prevent, a lack of response from local governments or planning. To our flood, we have been conducting many surveys to our community as a rapid response, as an organizing opportunity to understand from our community their most basic needs, but also how has emergency response been deployed here related to the flooding. And many community members ask us, well, how can we know more about the river and if we're likely to flood again? Our farm workers workforce is predominantly Indigenous speaking in our communities, and they pose unique opportunities and challenges when organizing and trying to deal with planning. We know that community members live in areas very close to our Nooksack River, likely to experience being overflooded, or also due to nature of work, experience extreme weather conditions because working outside. So our promotoras have been on the forefront with a couple different campaigns related to environmental justice. And this is really crucial when we are talking about high level planning with developers and planners who may not have us in mind due to a variety of reasons, lack of representation, language, implicit bias. They never think about us. So the community members have been involved in quite a different level of campaigning related to environmental justice, one related to heat. So heat, smoke, and wildfires. We're involved in a coalition of farm workers and farm worker advocates across 3 states to push for consistent rules related to heat, wildfire, and smoke. Our state is going through a rulemaking process. So that is a gateway for participation with workers' rights, but also understanding that we also need to understand how to mitigate the challenges of climate change. So these types of spaces related to growth management are crucial when farm workers want to be in spaces where there's actually planning being implemented at our local and state levels. The second thing is related to flooding. So how can community members work with emergency response for planning for future floods, because the farm workers know that they're going to be flooded again. A lot of our community members in Sumas and nearby cities have been flooded twice or 3 times, depending on rain that has come our way. And also understanding that where their housing is will also dictate, if they're going to be susceptible to a lot of this response to or lack of response of emergencies. So a lot of farm workers want to know about river management. They want to know, like, why are certain services in this area? Why is my housing in this zone? They're really curious, and they have such great commentary on the rapid response surveys about what needs to be done and what information they need to know to keep themselves safe, and also provide back to the economy that they are participating in here in Whatcom and Skagit counties. Predominantly a lot of land here in our county. We are well known for our berries, and agricultural land has been lost due to flood. So how can we work with other groups to figure out how to keep the economy viable, but also to understand that climate change is real and we need to adequately plan with farm workers who are a large labor force in our counties. A third part of this environmental justice work is not just, dealing with disasters. How can we take a preventative approach and build the new? So community and promotoras are always looking for opportunity to strengthen our cooperatives. Cooperatives to land use related to making sure that we are treating the land with respect and treating it without toxic chemicals, and providing alternative for our communities to understand the connection of land and to work, and also to our culture and traditions. So we support as promotoras the development of the cooperative Tierra Libertad, Land and Liberty in Everson, Washington, and agroecology practices to build the new, stewarding the land in a way that we can show that there is a way to plan. If you're going to plan services or things related to what farm workers need to be active participants in their community, it's there in a cooperative model. So we also push for that as well. Climate resiliency is encompassing all that. It's involving the people, not just embedding them in existing structures for participation, but to understand their unique challenges related to housing and planning and services, representation and planning. We know in our community that there's not people who come from our community planning, or they're not developing our communities. Being conscious of the decision-making of having a farm worker voice for planning purposes. We know that because we actually have an urban planner on our team who's studying school and is a Latina, who has really guided our approach to considering planning in a different way. Farm workers have been participating in multiple community data-driven strategies for climate resiliency. For instance, there is a connection between land use and housing, right? As my compañera mentioned in the previous panel. We've done housing studies around farm workers, and number one, again, farm workers say if they had viable housing that is close to their community services, that they're part of the community, they would stay in the state to work and support the economy here. And again, investment in our communities is crucial for climate resiliency and having farm worker voice in that decision making. Why we support this piece of legislation, we understand this is a pretty high level type of piece of legislation, but we understand there's connections between land use and permitting and things that happen in our local area, that farm workers are understanding the level of planning that needs to happen for us to weather the storms or the disasters coming our way, because the food system is changing and farm workers have been taking notice of this for quite some time. It will impact their jobs, it will impact their livelihoods, and also it will further disrupt the community's ability to support local areas for their economies. So we know that there's connections to this, and that's why we're involved. Again, my last point is farm workers want to engage, and I think the opportunities to engage need to be included in legislation like this. And we have definitely some feedback about what could be improved with this piece of legislation, but it's definitely a good start to actually include the most impacted, who work the land and steward the land from now and going forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Australia, for just sharing all about your work and just the realities of the folks that you work with up in Whatcom County. And we are really excited to continue to work with you all and also with Front and Centered. And as much as we can year after year, continue to really center our land use planning and the Growth Management Act around these issues of environmental justice. So really appreciate you being here, offering your perspective. And with that, I will pass it to Breean to wrap us up. Breean, you can go ahead. I think you're still on mute.
So great to be here and hearing from these panelists and have an audience to talk about this. And I'm really here to speak from the perspective of local government. And really, it's even more than that. Someone in local government who didn't know much about land use before. I've been on the city council in Spokane for just about 6 years. I'm an attorney for 30 years doing litigation, and I've even done environmental cases before. But I really didn't understand the importance of planning and land use really until the last 2 or 3 years. So I just wanted to talk about that because House Bill 1099 would mandate planning requirements having to do with climate resiliency and climate change. And why is that a good idea? So one of the things that in Spokane I've helped lead for the last almost 3 years now is our own climate resiliency planning. And I just kind of want to use that as an example, and in a little bit I'll paste it into the chat so you can see our plan. But we just passed a very comprehensive plan with well over 100 steps that will really help Spokane be more resilient and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and really connects both environmental and social and economic issues together. And that includes land use. So our plan was put together by about 40 people from the community, all volunteers led by one staff person that we had who was fabulous. Her name's Kara Odegaard. And we divided them into smaller groups, and they dealt with transportation, they dealt with housing, they dealt with land use, they dealt with the natural environment, the built environment, economic development, and really even training a new workforce. Try to put all those things together. And we focused on 3 things. The first thing we focused on was meeting the state standards of reducing emissions by 95% by 2050 in the stair-step standard. The second thing we focused on was creating a more resilient Spokane in the face of climate change and economic change caused by climate change. Our big issues in Spokane are wildfire smoke and water shortages. And we struggle with that, particularly in the last 5 to 7 years. And that's what impacts us immediately. But as I mentioned before, we're also quite a poor community within the city of Spokane. And the third thing we put in our plan is to prioritize the benefits and mitigate the detriments to the most impacted communities. And the reason that I really like a plan around this is that climate chaos is happening, and you can either react to it or you can plan to mitigate it. Also, the laws, both from the state and the federal government, are coming one way or the other. And our point of putting a Spokane focused plan was so that we could play to our strengths and minimize our weaknesses in meeting those emissions targets. So we found in our city that 46% of carbon emissions are from vehicle transportation, mostly personal vehicles. So that led us, of course, to conclude that we should try to have housing closer to the urban cores and fewer spread out suburbs, and retain the natural land for natural uses to mitigate emissions. And that's just a big, and to electrify our transportation, both in the city. We passed a law that's a companion to state law to electrify our fleet as a city. And we've worked hard and gotten grants to put in charging infrastructure throughout the city for all people, not just city workers. But that's a big focus of our plan, is electrifying transportation and reducing greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles. 48% of our CO2 emissions are from buildings. And again, that has to do with what the building standards are, how concentrated in the density of buildings. And between those two, that's nearly, 100% of our greenhouse gas emissions in Spokane. And so what I didn't realize before I got deep into city government was that both vehicles, miles traveled, and building standards can all be developed based on the comprehensive plan that guides land use and all sorts of things within a county and thus within the city. So I just really didn't understand that. I just thought land use was about money and real estate development and maybe protecting neighborhoods from not in my backyard sentiments that they might have. So I was surprised that the comprehensive plan is really the basis for so many things. So that's why 1099 is so important, I think, is that it would require communities other than Spokane, other than Bellingham, who are already willing to do the planning. It would require them to do it. And just so you know, local government never seems to have enough funding. And so it's kind of the last thing that people have time and resources for. It's not that they don't care, it's not that they don't want it, but they have to do the minimums first. And so that's why I think this bill is helpful, because it will get other communities to devote resources to this type of planning that will make a huge improvement in their community and the rest of the state, the nation, and the world. But one of the things about 1099 that City of Spokane is committed is getting an amendment to provide funding for that planning along with it. So we have supported it in the legislature last year, and we'll continue to support it this year. But we really think that local government needs funding to do that planning. Just, for our 2.5-year plan, we had more than one full-time equivalent employee, a very professional, well-qualified employee. So, we had to spend that money. It's totally worth it. But if the legislature can help, especially smaller towns without those resources, I think that will be of assistance. The second thing I just want to emphasize is what I like about this climate resiliency planning is it brings issues together and people together. So many times people have their specialties as far as what they're advocating for, both individually and as an organization. And people tend to kind of put you in a corner based on your organization or what you say your issue is. But climate resiliency and climate change bring housing together. It brings equity and inclusion together. It brings economic development together. It brings wildlife habitat restoration together. It brings it all together, city finances. It brings it all together. And so it's a great place, whatever your cause is, to come together in your community within the local planning process to move your entire community forward. And if you get a chance to look at our plan, I think you'll see that woven in the plan. It includes better relations with our indigenous tribes, dealing with people of color and poverty, and how to integrate them into our community as fully participating, and environmental issues. All those issues are all there. So I really think this bill and the movement to include climate resiliency in land use planning is a plus. And the last thing that I just want to call out to people is, I think the biggest obstacle out there to getting local government and kind of middle of the road people involved in this is the idea that you should focus on the upfront costs of something. Every time we talk about making buildings more energy efficient or putting solar on them or doing anything else land use wise, the first thing we hear is like, housing is so scarce, it's so expensive, people can't afford it, you're going to make people homeless by putting in green standards. But of course, we know over the long term that the real cost of housing and building is the operations of housing over time. It's, double, triple, quadruple the cost of the initial construction. And so it's really important for activists and leaders to really lead that conversation, I call a permaculture conversation, about really the long-term costs and the short-term costs and how to smooth those out, because really, if you have energy efficient housing that's affordable, that's what's going to really help people who are in poverty and trying to get into affordable housing that they can own. So I will leave it at that. I'm so pleased to be here and look forward to any questions. And I'll throw that link to the Spokane Sustainability Action Plan into the chat. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Breean. I was just about to say, feel free to share that plan. And Katie in Australia as well, feel free to share any information in the chat about how folks can get involved or support the work that you all do at your organizations. With that, everybody give our panelists a virtual round of applause for some amazing presentations and for taking the time to be here to share their expertise and their experiences and their perspectives. We have a little less than 20 minutes to do some Q&A. So if you have any questions for our panelists, I'll ask you to please share them in the chat. If you have a question for a particular panelist, please name them as you share your question, and I will direct them to the correct panelist. And if you just have a general question that you kind of would just like the panel to discuss, feel free to share those as well. I hope that you're all just ferociously typing your questions into the chat. We will. Loretta's interested in hearing a little bit more about what community to community would like to see in House Bill 1099. Australia, I don't know if you're able to speak any more to that than you've already touched on in your comments.
Yeah, I guess, looking over this bill, the biggest thing was just, what's the definition of climate resiliency in the bill, and how is there participation allocated for this planning process, especially when it relates to environmental justice definitions. That's basically our intention with this bill. Like, where is the community input through being active in this process? But those would be like the two big ones. The language and the intention of where it wants to go is something that we aligned with, but it's just a matter of what is climate resiliency in this context for the bill. So yeah.
Thanks, Australia. And yeah, we are very excited to keep working with you and with Front and Center to incorporate as much of that into this legislation as we're able to this session. I know we are also working with Front and Center and looking at a few different bills beyond House Bill 1099, where we might be able to incorporate some of this language around, more specific language around what does resiliency look like, how do we address environmental justice through planning, and how do we make sure that our planning processes are more equitably participatory. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have some more movement on those fronts in the next couple of weeks. So let's see, a question from Marilyn. Are any of the COVID-related federal funds available to fund the cost of GMA planning? I do not know. Breean, do you know?
I can take that only because at the city, we were allocated quite a bit of money from the American Recovery Plan Act. And so we've been diving into what can be used and not. So the short answer is that there's about 6 different potential uses that you have to fall under for a specific use. And it'll just depend on how you frame it, but it's probably unlikely. But one of the uses that any city or county can do is if they lost revenue in 2020 and 2021, they can just use their COVID relief money to replace that. And once you do that, you can use it for any city purpose. And so the short answer is, and this is worth advocating for at your cities because they may or may not understand that, is that if they use their revenue replacement share of COVID relief, they can do anything. So, but they may first tell you no, they can't because it's not in the law.
Great, thank you for that, Breean. Let's see, we have, what other questions do we have? Let's see, Yolanda has a question about more state and federal policy around the Environmental Protection Agency and the power that was taken away by the Trump administration. I, Yolanda, do not know the answer to your question apart from contacting your federal representatives and advocating that they give power back to the EPA, but I don't know if any of our other panelists have any ideas on that through their work. It's a little outside of my scope, unfortunately. I think more of a comment from Paula that maybe these bills will also help in spreading regenerative agriculture and ecologically sustainable local food resources and processing. Yeah, Paula, I know that's not specifically referenced in the bill as they are, but I think we can imagine that, you know, as we start being more intentional with our land use planning and what, you know, areas of our state we're protecting and the ways in which we want to be using our land to be more sustainable and resilient, I think we know that having more food sovereignty and local food production and security is a really important way to, you know, make ourselves more resilient from some of the impacts of the climate crisis. So I guess, yeah, although it's not specifically referenced in the bill so far, I think that, you know, as we look toward implementing this on a local level, that is something that, you know, you all can advocate for with your own planning committees when this bill passes and they are working to implement it on the local level. Let's see. Why is there no enforcement of the laws we already have? Is that,
I'll jump in on that. And this is, you know, I used to adopt the narrative that I'd heard out there that, oh, the EPA and the environmental state organizations were just horribly, tons of regulations, and they were just enforcing everything and destroying the economy. I heard that in the news and I just thought that was true. And then once I got into doing litigation to try to protect the environment, I realized that those agencies don't do that much that way. It's very political. They get into trouble when they do. And so I've kind of two answers. One is private attorneys with especially with nonprofits can do some of the enforcement. But the other thing after being in city government is that you really, I think, or we have to change the minds and hearts of people to understand why it's of value to do it. And it's not enough to just tell them that it's a crisis or there's a problem. We really have to connect stories to their lives and make a difference. And so, you know, it was great hearing from Australia today of exactly how climate change was impacting people and organizing around that. And I'm just a big fan of changing people's minds and hearts by connecting with them. And then suddenly it's easier to get the political power to enforce the laws. And I just can't overemphasize that enough, that seems in my many years of activism, that winning in court is not enough. We have to win the hearts and minds of, you know, a majority of the people, even maybe a super majority, to really get the change.
Thanks for that, Breean. So in Spokane, what kinds of policies can the city enact to help reduce vehicle miles traveled as a key component in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector? Many decisions that affect VMT are made at the state level. How does the city make up for lack of progress from washed out projects? And then are you able to retrofit neighborhoods to integrate more local scale commercial into residential neighborhoods? So that is a bit of a compounded question, Breean,
right,
which I think is probably the easiest for you to address.
I'll try to go fast. So some of the tools that we have to reduce miles is we do give incentives for greater density downtown, particularly multifamily tax incentives, and then just height density bonuses. So the more people that we get to live near the city core, those are just fewer miles there. By the same token, as a city, we've also many times not approved apartment complexes out on the edge of our city limits. And that's, that's where the land is cheaper. And so again, a developer just trying to turn a profit on a short-term project, they'll want to go out there. So it's incentives and then land use prohibitions. And then the other thing we do is, or we're really engaged in, we haven't finished it, but we're in the middle of what we call transit-oriented development, where if there's a high-performance transit line, which in Spokane is buses, not light rail, we allow actual commercial businesses there and apartment buildings and townhouses in neighborhoods that would otherwise be single family because there's really good transit there. Another thing we do is currently we're making a higher priority to build quality bicycle infrastructure so people can feel safe and confident riding their bicycles. And when we do that, they choose to do that. And then the last one, there's many other things kind of like that, but the last one we did is we created a zoning change in single family neighborhoods. If there's a building that used to be a commercial building, people can activate it as a coffee shop or any other commercial thing where they wouldn't have been able to do that before. And we reduced the parking requirements around that. So just in my neighborhood on the South Hill, there's a bakery coffee shop that used to be a grocery store called the Rockwood Bakery. And it's one of the most popular places and people walk all over to get to it.
Thank you, Breean. I see quite a few comments in the chat just about the enforceability of the Growth Management Act. And I would say that definitely is one of the pitfalls of it as it is currently written, is that it has historically, in many ways, been tricky to enforce because it really does hinge on public participation and individuals and organizations really tuning in and being involved in their planning process and then taking action if they think that their county or city is doing something that's non-compliant. And so that's part of what, a big part of what FutureWise does as an organization is that we are constantly tracking comprehensive planning processes and amendments across the state and bringing appeals to the Growth Management Hearings Board if we think that folks are out of compliance and working with local partners all across the state as we do that work. But we also are always thinking about ways that we can pass legislation that will make the Growth Management Act more effective and enforceable. I would be interested to hear maybe a little bit from Katie and from Australia, just in your work and from your perspective, what are some of the principal things that we need to be keeping in mind or doing as we think about rural climate change resiliency? I know that's a little bit of a broad question, but if you had to pick like kind of 3 things we really need to be focusing on as we're thinking about how to ensure that our rural areas and communities are more climate resilient, what would those be?
I can jump in. So I would say that my work is primarily in forest work. And so a lot of the things that I'm thinking about with climate resiliency are those impacts to more forest-based ecosystems and the rural communities that are adjacent to them. So for me, I think that having planning that's really sensitive to that wildland urban interface is step number 1. Step number 2, I think it's super important that we focus attention on making sure that we are providing resources to communities that are most at risk from wildfire and smoke. And so that's people who work outdoors, people who are unhoused, people who don't have access to transportation. And then finally, I would say that healthy forests are also incredibly important for supporting communities near them. So making sure that we are practicing ecological forestry practices is really critical to how that impacts the communities that are nearest to them and where people work.
Thanks, Katie.
Yeah, in addition to that, I would also say from just like the rural perspective here in like Whatcom and Skagit counties is like to make sure that there's participation from the impacted community in terms of like land use, like actually providing what is going on right now and what has changed with the effects of disasters. So like for instance, areas that have been burned or most affected for smoke. We know that in our rural communities, just the geography just traps smoke a lot more than if you were to go into like a suburban area like Bellingham, right? Or Mount Vernon. We know from the disparities map from the Department of Health, different types of social determinants of health that impact our community. So we have data as well about traffic and pollution and other factors that will exacerbate the effects of environmental hazards and things like that. For our communities, especially with this flood, it's just fresh in our minds and we're still trying to survive through it. It's like understanding where are those flood zones. We don't even know where those zones are holistically, like with the community that we surveyed. So like understanding where that is and making sure that if there is going to be rebuilding, because one comment from a community member was like, well, if everything's washed away, maybe we can start new. And I was laughing with this individual because he's had such a positive outlook. He lost everything. He is living in his car. He's been housed now in temporary shelter, but that's for people here affected by the flood, it's going to be a long time. And we have already in a growing issue, especially in our state and all across the US, about growing homeless population issue of housing people. So there's a lot of work to be done, right? Outside of this type of level of planning, but like housing being intentional and putting in places based on where community can commute and actually having transportation access to a lot of our agricultural sites. Predominantly, a lot of farm workers use single person vehicles or they carpool, as indicated in our COVID-19 farm worker study that we did with Oregon and California. There's nuances because of how the city is designed here. So we kind of need to know more information to be prepared to make actual solutions for our community. And I think it all starts with, again, planning and participation and spaces for those communities. So it's great to take a peek at Spokane's planning. Thank you for sharing that, because we want to do that level of planning in rural communities. Rural communities, again, have a distinct level of like how they want to do things, and some people who are in our community based on who's out there can influence voice a lot more in planning efforts. In our community, it's the agricultural industry, much like some other counties. So it's really tough sometimes to find common ground of like what's needed for our community members to actually participate and also make sure that we're addressing climate change. So yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Australia, for sharing. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for Q&A. If anybody has any more questions about this topic, the Growth Management Act, House Bill 1099, feel free to send me an email and I will either answer it myself, ask our policy expert, or I can also get in touch with our panelists if you have a specific question for one of them. But before we hop off, I do just want to share a little bit of information about House Bill 1099, which we have been talking about in this panel, and it is a bill that FutureWise is working on with our partners and our champions in the legislature that would help improve and enable local jurisdictions to do better planning around the climate crisis. And so House Bill 1099 is a bill that is sponsored by Davina Dewar, and it would add a climate change element to the Growth Management Act. Right now, climate change isn't even mentioned in the Growth Management Act at all, which is pretty wild given how, as we've been discussing today, closely related our land use decisions are with both the impacts that we have and our contributions to the climate crisis, and also our ability to protect our most vulnerable communities and our critical habitats and ecological systems from the climate hazards that we're already experiencing. So this bill has two main parts. One part will require that our largest and fastest growing counties and the cities within them are making plans to reduce their vehicle miles traveled and their greenhouse gas emissions to help meet state goals for reduction. So this is work that Council President Beggs was sharing about. They're already doing in Spokane. This bill will just require that counties and cities across the state are also doing this work. It also then requires that all counties and cities planning under the Growth Management Act are planning to address the impacts of climate hazards on people, property, and ecological systems. So doing that really important planning to ensure that we are, as we're growing, we are building communities that are resilient to the impacts of climate change. It also does include a definition of environmental justice in the Growth Management Act for the first time ever, and stipulates that our land use planning should work to achieve environmental justice and not worsen existing environmental health disparities. And as I mentioned, we are actively working with our partners across the state to continue to think of ways that we can incorporate that environmental justice lens more fully into the Growth Management Act. And timing is really critical for this bill. This year is our last chance to pass the bill before, and for it to be implemented before the next round of comprehensive plan updates are due in 2024. So if we don't pass this bill this year, it will be essentially another 10 years before King, Pierce, Snohomish, and Kitsap counties might be required to do this really important planning around climate change. So it really is important that we pass House Bill 1099 in the 2022 legislative session. And just a few ways that you can help if you're interested in making sure this legislation gets over the finish line in 2022. You can join our email list to get updates and calls to action throughout session. You can also fill out our advocacy form to let us know how you want to be involved, and we will reach out and offer you support in your advocacy. And then you can also take a minute to email your legislators right now and ask them to vote yes on House Bill 1099. And even to make it, a stronger bill that will more fully address the ways that the climate crisis intersects with issues of environmental justice. So we have shared links to all of those actions in the chat, and we will also include them in a follow-up email that you all will get later today that will have a recording of this panel for you to look back on if you want, as well as those links to action. Again, as always, please feel free to reach out to me at jamie@futurewise.org with any questions, or if you want to learn more about how you can get involved. And thank you so much again to all of our panelists, and I hope that you all have really great afternoons. We'll see you soon.